So welcome everyone to another Claremont Institute webinar. Today we're talking about the soon to be voted on, many folks have already voted on it, of course, Prop 16 here in California. I just wanted to bring on some experts to help us understand this issue. I, of course, am Ryan Williams, president of the Claremont Institute, publisher of the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind. And I'm joined today by Althea Nagai, who's a research fellow at the Center for Equal Opportunity, has been doing work on affirmative action and its effects, a lot of statistical work for many years, and has done studies on many colleges, and is going to share some of that information with us and help us sort through what the effects of Prop 16 might be. And then Richard Sander, Rick, is a distinguished professor of law at UCLA. He works on a lot of issues, but more specifically on issues of racial inequality, and it has written a lot on affirmative action and its effects in higher ed, and has a new book out, or most recent book on housing segregation and its effects by Harvard University Press. So I encourage you all to take a look at Althea and Rick's work after the webinar. And Althea is going to lead us off by just talking about some of her research, and then Rick will clean up. We'll probably be about 20 minutes or so between the two of them, and then we'll open it up for questions. I'll just say one more thing by way of introduction. The original goal of Prop 209 was really to bring in line California practice in government, that is in higher education and contracting and in state hiring. What was the original promise of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which was to finally realize the colorblind promise of the Declaration of Independence, at least in the area in which they had authority at the state level. So basically all of government, contracting, hiring, and higher education. It's had a good run since 1996, and now it's on the docket and for repeal. I think it's just really just a coincidence. This was on its way to a vote long before the George Floyd incident and the summer of riots and unrest and protests, but it sort of added a new level of drama to all of this. So I wanted to, among other things, lower the temperature a little bit and just help us understand this issue. And so I'm happy that Althea and Rick joined us today. So with that, Althea, lead us off.
Okay. I'm a research fellow at the Center for Equal Opportunity. Linda Chavez, president and chair, and Roger Clegg is emeritus general counsel. Okay, when we first started doing our studies on universities, our first three universities were the University of California, Berkeley, San Diego, and Irvine. And we just looked at students. And this was in 1995, right before Prop 209 passed. Okay, what we found back then was basically about for Berkeley, we had these enormous test score gaps among those enrolled. This was in 1995. We had a 180-point math gap between blacks and whites. We had a 150-point verbal gap between blacks and whites. We had a grade gap. It was to a lesser extent, but same pattern for Irvine and for San Diego. Okay. Now, our critics said, okay, well, but you don't really know who was rejected. You have to know all those that went other places. You need the whole data set. So we subsequently tweaked our analyses and we introduced more statistical analyses. And what I decided with this, now that Prop 16 is on the ballot, I decided to do, thanks to Gail Harriet, who came up with the idea, let's compare what California schools would look like if they passed Prop 16. The closest school I found was the University of Virginia, which we had just finished in 2019. We used 2016 data. University of Virginia is ranked comparably in the US News ranking. It's about the same as Berkeley and UCLA. Irvine is just a little bit lower, and so is San Diego. So, this is a critical school. The other critical school is the University of Michigan, which we got data in 2005, right after the Supreme Court said you could use race and you could use diversity as a factor. Again, We got the complete data set. What this means is we got, for every applicant, we got test scores, we got grades, gender, race, state residency, and whether or not they had a legacy connection. So with all this data, I could run this logistic regression analysis, which is a fancy word for saying I could compare the odds of, let's say, a Black getting in versus a white getting in, all other things being equal, and it comes out as what I call an odds ratio. Okay, so with that in mind, the school that I thought was the most comparable was the University of Virginia. In 2016, Blacks were admitted at a higher rate than whites and Asians. Same thing with Hispanics. But what this means is there was an incredibly large SAT gap where you had Blacks, the Black-white SAT gap was about 180-point difference. You had something comparable. The Asian gap, Asian-white gap was about 60 points. So Asians actually scored higher than whites overall. So you can imagine what the Black-Asian gap was. And these are for those admitted, not for those who ended up enrolling, okay? So, and of course we had similar gaps in grades. Again, what they wouldn't tell us was what region of the state people came from. But what we did find was, after analyses, we ran our logistic regression, and basically the odds of being Black versus the odds of being white getting admitted, the odds ratio was 7-to-1. Much better if you're Black versus white. The Hispanic to white was 2-to-1, and the white over Asian, the white got somewhat smaller preference compared to Asian, was 1.25 over 1. It's really small. The residency requirement. In-state residents got a 5.5-to-1 odds ratio. If you're in-state, you had that much of an advantage versus out-of-state. In other words, if you're a white in-state resident, you actually, all other things being equal, had a harder time getting into your own state university than if you were Black, out-of-state. And that's where it starts to fall into this realm of public policy. Virginia residents don't know this. Virginia students who apply, Virginia students who are admitted, those who enroll, do not know this data. This is all basically kept under wraps by the university. Thanks to our general counsel, this is how we get the data, and this is how we did the analysis. It was even more extensive in 2005 when we got the data from the University of Michigan. Michigan, the gaps were even greater between Blacks and whites. This is right after Greta, so they could use race, and boy, did they use race. The Black-white test score gap was about, 200 points. There was a grade gap. And again, the Black to white odds ratio was 70-to-1 this time. It was huge. There was a lung cancer study where your odds of getting lung cancer if you smoked over time was something like 14-to-1. Okay, so put it in that perspective. This is huge. Whites had a slight advantage over Asians. This is starting to emerge here. All of these are better odds ratios, Black to white, Hispanic to white. Their odds ratios are much higher than if you're an in-state Michigan resident. So all other things being equal here too. If you're in-state Michigan resident and you're white, you have less of a chance of getting in than if you're a Black out-of-state applicant. All of this ended supposedly in Michigan when they passed, in 2006, they passed Proposal 2. I am, by the way, worried that, after this happens in California, if they pass Prop 16, that the activists in Michigan will start trying to bring back race in the next election cycle. Okay, so that's kind of where we stand. And there was a third case, which is the University of Wisconsin, which had even larger odds ratios because it was even lesser competitive than Michigan and Virginia. So it was less noted of a school. So most of its applicants, I think they had to really expand the pool and reach deep down and wide to get the appropriate number of what they thought was to create a properly diverse student body. So you have these outrageous odds ratios you have these outrageous 100, 200 point SAT gap. You have a percentile academic ranking gap of 10 points. I mean, the whites and Asians are in the 90th percentile and the blacks and Hispanics are in the 80th. So we're really talking about large gaps. And at Wisconsin, you have a 500 to 1 odds ratio, which looks really astounding, except that's actually the odds ratios if you're an athlete trying to get into Harvard. So that's an aside to put into context. Okay, so these are all exponential, but in effect, taxpayers are supporting, when they use race as a factor, taxpayers are supporting, especially for whites, and now more and more, I think, Asian kids. Taxpayers are supporting out-of-state, underrepresented minorities in order to get, over their own in-state taxpayer applicants. And this is not debated. This is not known. One of the big things we found in our studies is how non-transparent, how private the universities treat this information. We've had to go to court. In Wisconsin, we went all the way up to the state Supreme Court. So as I said, if this happens, if Prop 16 happens in California, expect a lawsuit. Okay, Rick, tossing it to you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Althea and Ryan, for organizing this, and delighted to be here. So I'm both a law professor and economist, so I work on some of the legal issues involved. I actually have a lawsuit against the University of California going right now to get data. I don't know if you knew about that, Althea, but it's coming to trial later this month, later in November. And I'm familiar with a lot of the social science. I've done some of the social science on the issue of what affirmative action does, what its effects are. Althea and I are both critics of affirmative action, so you're getting more of one side of the debate here, but I've been in about 20 debates over the last couple months with proponents of Prop 16, and I'm familiar with their arguments. I'm happy to talk about those as they come up in Q&A. And I think the things that I'm going to say in the next few minutes are pretty controversial. I mean, uncontroversial. I don't think that they've been questioned by proponents on the other side. So one general point is that this distinction between racial preferences and affirmative action. The proponents of Prop 16 argue that this is a measure to restore affirmative action, and the opponents focus on its potential to create racial discrimination. Both sides are right in a sense, and the reason why they're taking those different positions is that about 70% of Americans generally support affirmative action, but about 70% generally oppose racial preferences. And I don't think it's that people are confused. I think there really is a distinction. Affirmative action is a broader term that includes things like outreach, efforts to reform admissions processes, make sure they're fair, trying to transcend old boy networks and really create more accessible processes of selection. Whereas Prop 16 and Prop 209 were specifically about racial preferences, which are a form of affirmative action, but they're the form that involves making individual decisions that are using race and gender. And a lot of Althea's work is essentially making the point that that factor, when used, especially in universities, tends to be used very, very heavily. When the Supreme Court has ruled on affirmative action and the use of preferences in higher education, they've consistently said, well, it's fine for universities to create diverse student bodies, and it's fine for them to take into account a variety of factors. And their implicit assumption is that race is just kind of like other factors. But you find that when you study actual university admissions, race is a much larger factor. And in some schools, it's no larger than it is for athletes, but in a lot of schools, it's much larger than it is for athletes. It's much larger than it is for legacies. In most schools, it's much larger than it is for the in-state preference, and so on. Very significantly, it swamps socioeconomic status. And one of the biggest concerns that I have about the use of racial preferences is that schools that do it tend not to spend much time thinking about or using socioeconomic preferences. And so a lot of the beneficiaries of their preference programs are racial minorities from middle class or upper middle class backgrounds. It was learned in the Harvard lawsuit that Harvard actually gives a negative weight to African Americans if they're from poor or working class backgrounds. They strongly prefer to have upper middle class blacks be the recipients of their admissions preferences. So that kind of segues into what happened in California when Prop 209 passed. The predictions of a lot of UC leaders was that this would have a catastrophic effect on minority enrollment. I think the Berkeley chancellor predicted there would be an 80% drop in Black and Hispanic enrollment if Prop 209 passed. That didn't happen. And part of the reason it didn't happen is that folks were exaggerating, but a lot of it is that the university took the whole challenge very seriously. Before Prop 209, universities within the UC system had relied on racial preferences as kind of, it makes our job simple. We look at the applicant pool, we give whatever preference we need to get the racial composition we want. After Prop 209, folks really started looking at the pipeline. And I was involved with two major university efforts to try to address this. And we developed a whole bunch of outreach strategies. We started looking at how to use socioeconomic preferences. We formed partnerships between individual campuses and inner-city schools. We did a whole bunch of things that were all geared towards really trying to make sure that high school applicants in working class neighborhoods knew how to qualify for UC and how to apply and to improve their high school experience. And this was amazingly successful. The number of African American applicants to the UC system was flat for 9 years before Prop 209, and it tripled in the 10 years after Prop 209. The number of Hispanic applicants had gone up about 20% before Prop 209 and went up about 400% in the 10 years afterwards. It was phenomenal. The schools became, so as a result of that, because the pipeline was much better, URM numbers didn't drop at all. They fell at the most elite schools, Berkeley and UCLA, but that's because those schools had sort of suctioned up all the Black and Hispanics with their preferences before. Half of all the Blacks in the UC system in 1997 were at Berkeley and UCLA. So students were more spread out. They were generally better matched with other students who had similar academic backgrounds. So URM numbers dipped in the first year about 5% and then started going up and never looked back. Absolute numbers of Blacks and Hispanics are dramatically higher than they were now, dramatically higher now than they were beforehand. And they're also better represented relative to the pool of high school graduates. That's a point that's really not generally known or understood. But for example, Hispanics were a third of high school graduates when Prop 209 passed, but only 13% of UC students. They're now about 45% of high school graduates and 33% of UC students. So both in absolute and relative terms, Hispanics are doing much better. The Hispanic high school graduation rate has gone from 66% when Prop 209 passed to 88% now. That's a 2/3 reduction. Mm-hmm. And I'm pretty sure that improvement has not occurred anywhere else in the country to that degree. So it is reasonable to attribute it, at least in part, to what UC did and what the state did after Prop 209 to try to mitigate its effects. I think the last point I'll make before we get into questions is how all this translated into what we call the mismatch phenomenon. So the mismatch occurs when students are going to schools where their credentials are much lower, where there are a couple 100 points gap in SAT scores or half a point in high school GPA. Then students will struggle in environments where they're surrounded by much better prepared students. They'll more often not graduate. They'll more often migrate from difficult majors, often STEM majors, to less difficult things like communications. And we saw all this in dramatic fashion at UC before Prop 209. At my school, UCLA, the 4-year graduation rate for African Americans before Prop 209 was 15%.
Wow.
Yeah. 6-year graduation rate was better, but it was, I think, below 50%. And the proportion of students who stayed in STEM programs and graduated was, I don't know, something like a quarter. All those trends reversed after Prop 209. And it wasn't entirely because of getting rid of preferences. The schools started paying more attention to these issues generally, so white and Asian graduation rates went up as well. But in relative terms as well as absolute terms, Black and Hispanic improvements were remarkable. The 4-year graduation rate for Blacks tripled in the 15 years after Prop 209. 6-year graduation rate went from something like the high 40s to the low 70s. Nationwide, the proportion of Blacks who get STEM degrees has been very flat at about 21% for a couple of decades. At UC, it was in the high teens before Prop 209. Now it's almost 30%. So every dimension that we've looked at, you see really remarkable improvements. So, you know, I think it was legitimate when Prop 209 passed to say, well, this might really be bad, but the experiment was done and it turned out to be remarkably successful. Thanks.
Yeah. We can open with a question that you've kind of already answered, Althea, which is from Michael. He asks, do you think that if Prop 16 passes, it might be subject to constitutional challenge, especially under the 14th Amendment? And he cites the analogy of Romer, of course, dealing with homosexual rights rather than racial preferences. But yeah, I don't know if we have anything to add other than to say, yes, of course, it'll be challenged.
It's very hard to get a lawsuit up to that point. I mean, everybody's kind of watching with the Harvard, you know, the Harvard case and now Yale. The hope is it's really hard to find a plaintiff. I mean, CEO has oftentimes signed on, or we've written, you know, amicus briefs. I think Rick also has participated in one too, in a couple also. But, you know, it's just really hard to find a plaintiff because that person is going to get, it's real tough, really, really tough. And I'm not convinced the Supreme Court will go as far as overturning completely. I mean, they're chiseling away at it, but I don't know if they'll take that final step. So,
right.
Well, why don't I throw out a couple of things?
Yeah.
So the Harvard lawsuit is currently before the First Circuit. Mm-hmm. I think it's pretty likely to be taken up by the Supreme Court. I don't think it's going to be hard on this court to find 4 justices who want to hear it. The last several Supreme Court decisions were 5-4. Mm-hmm. And in Fisher, you know, 4 of the justices who are all still on the court very strongly dissented and embraced reasoning very similar to what the Harvard plaintiffs are arguing. So I can imagine a pretty sympathetic Supreme Court. What's important to keep in mind is that Prop 16 would be subject to challenges different from those in the Harvard lawsuit. For one thing, the Supreme Court has specifically said that a majority cannot enact preferences on its own behalf. And in California, Hispanics and African Americans together make up a majority of the population. So that's very different from a traditional affirmative action scenario. All the affirmative action cases have been about what are called benign preferences, where you have a majority trying to create a preference for a minority. And in California, that's a much more muddled issue. The second thing is that it's very clear that the main targets of Prop 16, in a negative sense, are going to be Asian Americans. Right. They're going to very disproportionately, much more disproportionately than, for example, in the Harvard case, bear the brunt of reintroduced preferences if they come. And we know that because UCLA actually did some cheating in around 2010. They faced a lot of pressure to increase African-American enrollment, and they moved to what they called a holistic system. And a number of us challenged the university to do a study and pressured them into commissioning a distinguished sociologist to do a study. And he was doing it on behalf of the university. He was not doing it on behalf of us. He had access to all the internal data. And I was able, his report was kept a secret, but I was able to get it disclosed through a public records request. And it's pretty devastating. He found that over 5 years, over 1,000 Asian Americans had been denied admission over what would have occurred in a race-neutral process. The number of whites who were excluded was much smaller, like 150. So that gives you an idea of the relative magnitude of where discrimination would fall. And I think that constitutionally, discrimination against Asian Americans, especially in a state like California that has a problematic history with Asian Americans, is going to be a lot more vulnerable.
It brings up Gabriel's question he asks about Glenn Grosclose's work. And so you've kind of addressed it, right? So given the fact that Grosclose found that people were violating 209, or institutions were violating 209, how does this relate to the topic? Maybe you already answered it, Rick.
Yeah, Tim Grosclose was a political scientist at UCLA. He's now at George Mason. He's a good friend. He was on the University Admissions Committee when there were protests in, I think, the spring of 2007 about African American enrollment. So he was president of the whole process. He sort of saw the race neutral process that operated, and then the chancellor came to a meeting of the admissions committee and said, "We have to do something. Here's what I think we should do." Kind of laid out the strategy, and then watched as it was implemented. And he had no doubt what was going on. And the study, what's called the Mayer study by the sociologist I mentioned, bore out everything that Tim said. One of Tim's important points is that, and the Mayer study showed this as well, that when you reintroduce preferences, SES automatically declines. And so Tim was able to find that many low-income Asians were being passed over under this new regime at UCLA in favor of very affluent Hispanics and African Americans. And, it's just very intuitively wrong.
Yeah. You, Rick, so you said you've been debating this a lot. What's the other side's response to the class issue here? And the fact of, the fact of this disproportionately helping well-heeled and sophisticated middle and upper middle class Blacks and Hispanics?
Honestly, I really don't think folks have had a good comeback. I mean, one general response, and I hope this doesn't sound, I guess I can't be free of bias, but I feel that when this debate really got underway in July and August, the proponents were really focused on the UC system as kind of the focus of why Prop 16 was needed. And as the facts started coming out about what actually happened, that strategy changed. If you look at a lot of the current materials from the S campaign, they're focused on state employment and contracting issues. They have really backed off to a significant degree on the UC issue. I think the most common comeback is to say, well, Hispanics in particular are still underrepresented. And that means there's not a level playing field. And of course, the response to that is that, well, when you're talking about a level playing field, you need to define who you think should be on the field. Clearly, I don't think anyone's arguing that UC admission should be a random selection of California high school graduates. It's clearly intended to be an elite school. It's intended to be a school for more academically successful students than, say, Cal State and the community college system. So if that's true, then there has to be some sort of floor that we're talking about. And if you create a floor and you look at the racial makeup of people above that floor, Hispanics are not underrepresented, even if you make pretty generous assumptions about where the floor should be set. So I'm I've not heard a good comeback to that. You know, there was a study done under the auspices of UC by Zachary Bleemer that made the rounds in the early summer. And I wrote a critique of it, and Bleemer has yet to respond. He's basically saying no comment.
You mentioned, Althea, that it's sometimes often very hard to get this data. Tim asks, you know, how can UVA, Michigan, or Wisconsin keep admissions data secret from the public? I mean, these are state-supported and controlled institutions. I suppose it has to do with state legislatures being unwilling to open that box. But
well, yeah. What's happened in the past is, and we had to learn this the hard way, is there are two barriers. One is the request always goes to the office of the state legal counsel, goes to the Attorney General's office. That's how important it is. Virginia and Michigan, Wisconsin, all went through the Attorney General's office. So if you have a sympathetic Attorney General, it really helps.
Right.
The other thing that was a major barrier is the Office of Legal Counsel within the university. They put up barriers, they put up, you know, they give you, when you ask for records, they give you paper records. So you get, you know, stacks and stacks and stacks of, or this nowadays, it's, you know, PDFs, which is unusable data, and they know exactly what we want. There've been instances where they've given us a bill of $20,000. I mean, this is not cheap. And, you know, in this particular case, the request was made, FOIA'd. The FOIA is technically legal in particular states, and they were not forthcoming. So, you know, it really is a very costly enterprise if you're not inside the system to find out what exactly universities are doing. And none of this applies to the private universities. That kind of finding only comes out for the private universities if somebody goes through the trouble of suing. So.
Right.
Yeah. Which is why the Harvard case was so interesting. It was kind of the first window into what was going on in those schools. Yeah, let me give a little history, because I've spent a lot of time trying to get these records. 2003, when I was working on my first mismatch paper, I sent data requests to about 10 law schools, and 8 out of 10 responded with data pretty quickly. Wow. Yeah, it was not bad at all. And I think it probably helped that I was a law professor, and they sort of saw it as a collegial thing. And some of them said, "Send us your results when you do them." I then published this article, sort of documenting the size of preferences and some of the mismatch problems I found. 2007, I got funding to do a larger survey. I sent out about 140 requests to both graduate schools and undergraduates. The response rate was down to about 60%. And that was 60% after spending, you know, a lot of staff resources going back and asking for the data. In 2013, I did another set of requests, and I had about a 25% response rate. So over that decade, from 2003 to 2013, there was a dramatic drop in transparency in public institutions because schools were more ideologically driven, I think, in how they evaluated this, and they were afraid of litigation, but they were more willing to be untransparent. At the UC system, I went. In 2007, I sent a comprehensive request on behalf of 6 economists. And the school, UC initially said no, but we met with them and we negotiated. And after about a year, they became very helpful, and they produced a data set that we used for lots of these analyses of mismatch. In 2010, I said, "Can you update the data set?" And they said, "Sure." Then in 2011-12, some of the results of this research were published, and the school became less friendly. So in 2014, I made a request for law school data, and they said no, and we sued them. And once they saw we were serious about suing them, they settled. So I got the data, and they paid my attorney's fees, which were about $75,000. Then in 2017, I made a request for undergraduate data, and this time, they had a fully deployed defense. They said, "No, giving you individual level data, which is what you always need to do this kind of analysis we're talking about, would jeopardize privacy, even if we delete names and social.
They always say that.
Yeah.
Always.
And,
yeah.
Yeah, but they're now sort of trying to put that to a legal test. And so we sued them in 2018. This suit has been going on for 2 years. We've spent $250,000 on our side of the case. I think UC has spent well over $1 million defending it. We got a preliminary ruling about 6 weeks ago, indicating the judge is pretty sympathetic to our argument and thinks that sampling could be a strategy that will protect privacy. Of course, it's a strategy that will protect privacy and give us useful data at the same time. But that you know, I think that history should give you a really vivid idea of how determined schools have become, just over the recent past, to not be transparent. So the problem has gotten much worse in the last 2 decades.
I will add one caveat. There have been universities where the head of institutional research has been a quiet sympathizer. And once it got through Office of Legal Counsel, we got the data, and it was a clean data set, and it was everything we asked for in the form that we asked for. So there are individuals that are willing, but that was just a stroke of luck. So, you know, to be fair, there are people out there that are on your side.
Yeah.
Just got to find them.
Yeah, but these days they have to worry about being fired if that gets out.
If they get found out, yes.
We have a couple of questions that I'm going to combine. What about this? I mean, what you all are talking about and tracing the mismatch and pointing out the things that you both have done in various ways becomes much more difficult, of course, if the UCs drop the requirement for the SAT, which Richard says the UC Regents, I think I read this, they've dropped it for a year, I guess, using COVID as an excuse. So once these are removed, doesn't this every admission process really become a de facto holistic one? I guess the only, Richard brings it up and one of our other commenters does too, the only bar on it would be GPA, I suppose, where you might, you know, just kick the top % of every high school in the state to eligibility or something like that.
Yeah, well, yes, it's a good question, Ryan, because part of the point here is that regardless of whether Prop 16 passes or fails, we still have a significant problem in that the school administrators are ideologically very committed to figuring out ways to get preference-like effects. UC initially suspended the SAT, but then the regents had a vote in April to get rid of it. So there's no plan to resume the SAT at UC. What they've directed the administration to do is to come up with a new test and somehow create a test that doesn't have the racially disparate effects that the SAT has. That was a unanimous vote of the regents, and it was taken despite the fact that the UC Academic Senate, or the faculty leaders, wrote a unanimous report saying, don't get rid of the SAT. So the key analytic point here is, does the SAT discriminate against minorities? And what's almost never understood in these discussions is that, of course, SAT scores are much lower for Blacks than they are for whites, and they're somewhat lower for Hispanics, and they're a little bit higher for Asians than whites. These racial differences definitely exist. But the real analytic question is, does the SAT underpredict the performance of any group? In other words, is it an unfair measure because it's understating the actual potential of that group if they're given the chance to attend? And the answer is no. The SAT, the LSAT, the MCAT are all pretty accurate, quite accurate. And when you control for those things and you're predicting outcomes like college grades, race generally falls out of the equation.
Yeah.
For African Americans, there's actually a slight overprediction from the SAT. So, so that's why this is so goofy. Is that all you're doing is you're kind of making the process of admission more random.
Right.
You're not actually making it fair.
Well, the question is, wouldn't they replace, put a premium on AP classes, for example? I mean, that's the other substitute, and that's a national curriculum.
Yeah, or achievement
that's emerged, you know, in the last 10 years as a major factor, which we can't get a hold of because they said, well, you know, identify individuals, but I would think you have to have some way of differentiating besides reputation of the high school, right? And a grade point average. And the only other thing I can think of is, you know, your AP tests, your AP classes, because that's a standardized curriculum. I mean,
yeah, well, they haven't thrown out achievement tests, for example. But your basic point is right, Althea, that, you know, if you tell admissions officers they can't use the SAT, they will find other things, and things like AP scores will actually differentiate more based on class than the SAT will, because if you're going to a private school, then you'll probably have 10 AP classes and do on the tests.
So Nathan asked a question about, it's kind of a bit of a legal question. It's sort of interesting. I don't know if there's a good answer to it, but he says, you know, this is an interesting point about the majority enacting preferences for itself rather than benign preferences as you and the law has defined them, Rick. So who is the majority, quote unquote, majority with respect to Prop 16? Is it the majority of the general population, of registered voters, of student population? I doubt the latter or the third one, but this is kind of a jurisprudential or precedent question, I guess. I don't know the answer to this even remotely.
Well, no one knows the answer because there hasn't been a case like this. I mean, the precedent here is Croson, which was a Richmond case that went to the Supreme Court. And in Croson, the Supreme Court said the Richmond City Council, which had a plurality of African-American legislators, could not create preferences for Black contractors with city money. That was too much like self-dealing. The principle there would seem to apply here, but I don't think anyone has. I'm sure there's been no Supreme Court decision where that issue has arisen in the context of a referendum, and you know, any of those different ways of measuring who the majority is could be valid. It's possible that the majority of the voters in this election will be white, but even so, it's still, you know, the politics are clearly such that it's not hard to show how important minority legislators and minority votes are to this becoming law, and therefore there's still a pretty good jurisprudential argument for it. Another legal way that Prop 16 is vulnerable is goes back to a California precedent from 1967 called Milken, where California passed a Fair Housing Act banning discrimination in the housing market. And then California voters reversed it and said, no, we should have discrimination in the housing market. And the Supreme Court said, you know, it would be fine if you didn't pass the fair housing law in the first place, but once you've passed it, you can't repeal it. That's kind of invidious discrimination barred by the 14th Amendment. And so you can see that analogy could be drawn to Prop 209 and Prop 16.
Right. Michael asked just a very practical question of you, Rick. Is the stats you've given are very interesting. Do you have them anywhere collectible where Michael and others can post them and use them in discussions on social media? So arguing with friends and neighbors about this important question.
Oh, you mean some of the points that I'm making today?
Yeah.
Well, the No campaign has posted a couple of pieces that I've written in the last few months. So you can probably find some things there. If anyone wants to email me and follow up, my email is sander@law.ucla.edu.
Thank you. Very generous of you. Well, Paul asks the question of, I don't know if it's easy to answer this one or not. He says, you mentioned, Rick, that's the schools that do it, that is, use by hook or crook some holistic or other procedure to get racial balance rather than purely by merit. Are there really any schools that don't do it? Paul asks, aside from the usual suspects we all know, like Hillsdale or Grove City or others.
Caltech.
Caltech.
So my wife is a physics professor at Caltech, and she's currently the head of physics, math, and astronomy. And so I know all about Caltech's internal trainings, and they're a wonderfully principled institution. I'm very proud of her association with them. It's it has to do, I think, with them being so dominated by science fields, and I think Caltech experimented with preferences in the 80s, and the science mismatch problem just really bothered them, and so they backed off of it. But they just, there are a lot of good people there, and they believe in transparency, and they've actually they do a lot of outreach. I think the most recent freshman class was about 5% African American, which is, really good, given the gaps in SAT scores and so on. And they did it through a lot of outreach and relying a lot on personal recommendations and things that were good traditional affirmative action but didn't involve racial preferences.
Right.
Yeah. Regarding Caltech, I also want to add that Caltech, we did a comparison once a couple of years ago of Caltech and Harvard and MIT regarding legacy and Asian Americans, because this is when the Harvard lawsuit was starting. And Caltech did also make a point that they don't consider alums or legacy either. It's a pure merit, they said. So, okay, MIT considers race, but not alums, and Harvard, well, they give legacy and race preferences, among other things. So there you go.
I'll throw in one more plug for Caltech. There was a book written about 15 years ago called The Price of Admission that documented a lot of the corruption in higher education, where Brown University, for example, would just sort of sell spots to anybody who would build a new building. Caltech will not do any of that. And I gotta say the UC system is also is quite good. I mean, they generally don't give preferences to contributors or contributors' kids. They very, very few, if any, components of the UC take legacy status into account. So there are principles out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and now I also want to add, I noticed Prop 16 also includes gender, that they're going to introduce, they can bring gender back as a factor. And in our studies of universities, we've never found gender as a major factor when decisions are being made, admission decisions. I mean, that gets wiped out when you consider all the other variables. So I don't know. I guess this would be important in contracting maybe, or government jobs, but I don't think it's going to be a big factor.
A majority of UC students are now women, so it raises the interesting question of whether we'll have preferences for men.
Yeah, I was going to say across the country, really, higher ed, women are overrepresented given their.
But you control for grades and test scores, it doesn't come up. Right. It's strictly, just a coincidence because their test scores and grades are better. I mean,
well, Althea, let me just amend that slightly. I mean, there is a little higher propensity of women to apply to college than men.
Yes.
Men are a little bit more likely to go straight into jobs, often blue collar jobs. So especially in low moderate income families, women are a little more likely to go.
Yeah. Michael just asked if you'd repeat your email one more time, Rick.
Oh, yes. Sander, Sander, at law.ucla.edu.
Thank you. Nathan asks, we use these terms white, black, Asian, et cetera, but a large percentage of the students are biracial. How does that bear upon these issues we've been discussing?
Well, it's another good reason not to use race. It's becoming an increasingly goofy way of classifying people. I happen to have a son who's half black and half white. So how should we treat him? But a little more seriously, the schools, going back to the general theme of hypocrisy in higher education, the schools are so focused on entering classes that look like they're racially diverse. That Harvard, for example, an analysis found that of their so-called black admits around the year 2000, about 30% were actually foreign-born African,
Yep.
and about 30% were recent immigrants. who were born outside the United States and moved to the US. The white-black test score gap is smaller for, say, Haitian Americans or Nigerian Americans than it is for native-born Americans, native-born African Americans. So the Department of Education actually changed rules about 7 years ago to require colleges to report blacks in categories, with those who are actually native-born African Americans in a separate category, and schools reluctantly complied. But it just, it goes to how really artificial this is.
Yeah, and it speaks to the kind of American history of all this, right? Because affirmative action was sort of 3 points removed down the historical line from trying to redress the badges and incidences of slavery with civil rights laws in the late 19th century after the Civil War, and then so it's all part of that legacy. So under that argument, and I think we all reject the race-based preference side of that argument, but under that argument, it would be a little unfair to give it to Nigerian immigrants when they have no ancestral history of oppression in the United States.
Yeah, and of course, Hispanics are now the largest non-white group in the United States, and it's a much more problematic argument with Hispanics.
Right. Yeah, Mike Gonzalez, for our viewers and audience here today, wrote an essay for the Claremont Review of Books maybe 3 issues ago. Mike has a new book out on the category of Hispanics and how it was kind of created over the course of the 20th century, with a lot of, with the specific for many of the proponents of it, big foundations pushing, they wanted to create this new group that would be useful, among other things, to certain political constituencies and politicians as a group. And they drew the direct analogy to, we need to make Hispanics as a category like blacks and place them in the civil rights architecture and history of America. And this will be, useful under their own terms for various reasons, political and ideological. It's pretty interesting. So the essay, you don't have to buy the book. Read Mike's essay version of the Claremont Review books. It's pretty good. I'll bring up just one. It's more of a comment from Ken rather than a question. Yes, Ken is on Althea and he's asking questions. He says one of the great scandals, and Rick sort of brought it up a little bit with Brown or hinted at it. Recent scandals is, of course, well-heeled parents and celebrities bribing admissions officers, sort of 2 and 3 parts removed, through consultants to let their otherwise wastrel and layabout children get into schools they wouldn't normally get into. And Ken just says this is exactly what the Prop 16 campaign seems to be doing under at least a portion of our discussion here, which is if we're elevating the middle and upper middle class Black and Hispanic students, where Prop 16 campaign is expending lavish amounts of money to enable the privileged minorities students to get into schools where they otherwise would have been mismatched. And then Ken ends the question with, those parents are going to jail. I doubt any fate will fall the proponents of Prop 16. What about the polling of it? Have you all been following it? Last time I checked, it looked like it might not make it, which was welcome news when I saw it. But it's been a couple of weeks.
There were 2 polls that came out in the last week. One from the California Public Policy Institute of California, and one from Institute of Governmental Studies in Berkeley. And they showed pretty much the same thing: 37 to 38% in favor, 49 to 50% against, and 12 to 13% undecided. Now, I saw something this morning from the Yes campaign claiming that an exit poll of people who have already voted shows a majority in favor of Prop 16. So, it's definitely up for grabs, but it's looking pretty good for the opponents. And I think everyone in the No campaign was surprised because the events of June, the whole Floyd saga, the unanimity of Democratic legislators in putting this on the ballot, the the overwhelming margin that the Democrats have over Republicans in California. And Ryan, as you know, I'm a Democrat, but that's certainly Democrats will certainly be more likely to support this than Republicans. But the polling showed that Hispanics and Asians have flipped on this since 1996. In Prop 209, Prop 209 won primarily on white votes. There were significant minorities of the other groups that supported it, but all the other groups were net in favor of Prop 209. But this polling is suggesting that Asians oppose Prop 16 by a substantial margin and Hispanics by a narrow margin.
Interesting. Michael, one last practical question from Michael. What was the name of the 67 case where the Supreme Court overturned the repeal of the housing discrimination law?
Milken against Bradley.
Milken against Bradley. Thank you. Yeah. Well, great. Any closing thoughts, Althea?
I think this is just the first round. I think depending on how big the gap is, I mean, I'm hoping to have a decisive victory defeating Prop 16. If it's close, even if it's close, I think this is going to spur action in other states to, like Michigan. I mean, the one I'm thinking of is Michigan, really to overturn their anti-discrimination propositions. Is
this the first such proposition in the country?
No.
I think there's another. Oh, Washington. That's right. There was Washington State had something, didn't it?
Yes. Yeah. So in a way, this is the third round. There was SCA 5 back in 2014, which would have put a Prop 16 type measure on the ballot.
Right.
It passed the Senate by a large majority, and then the Asian American community, especially the Chinese American community, woke up and started staging rallies, and the assembly panicked, and they just abandoned it. And then there was the Washington effort last year, where the state legislature passed this measure, and then the opponents had to themselves get the measure on the ballot to overturn what the legislature had done. Right. They managed to do that, and then they won 50.5 to 49.5. It was very close.
Right.
But that was remarkable. This time in Prop 16, the proponents were much better aware of the potential pitfalls. That they lined up a lot of civil rights groups to endorse it. They lined up Asian American groups to endorse it. Yeah. So they really had a steamroller going, and that's why we were so surprised that the poll results were bad.
I mean, the contrast is really with contributions, where the overwhelming number of dollars went to the pro-16 side, and
about 20 million to 1.5 million. And the other interesting story is that the No campaign actually, although has much less money, they have many more contributors. So lots of very small contributors. The elites are just very strongly behind Prop 16.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting phenomenon that the elites have this really strong attachment to the preference strategy.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we've seen in various venues and various arguments this summer that, the kind of anti-racism regime, which includes racial preferences, is sort of ascendant on the left. And well, thanks, Althea, and thanks, Rick, for helping us understand this. And an hour flew by, and I appreciate your time and keep up all the good work. And I encourage everyone.
Good luck in California, everybody.
Thanks. Yeah, I encourage everyone to follow both Althea's and Rick's work.
And vote.
And otherwise. And vote.
Yeah, vote.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rick.
Yep.
Bye, Althea.
Bye-bye.